Hey all, Alex here at your home of the Music Deep Dive, and it is time for a review of the 1990 documentary mini-series, The Civil War by Ken Burns. Uh, Ken Burns is a name that is probably familiar to most Americans, certainly at this point. Chances are, if you have taken any sort of college class or perhaps even high school course on American history, you probably have been exposed to his work. Burns, of course, started out as a kind of documentary producer and cinematographer for various networks. He worked with the BBC for a while and got partnered up with PBS and made his name really through the feature-length documentary about the Brooklyn Bridge. And this is how he sort of gained his respect. But Ken Burns, as the kind of nationally known, widely recognizable name, really starts and ends, I think, with this particular piece. The Civil War was a major event when it came out. Very interesting considering that this was not necessarily a documentary meant to mark a specific milestone, as far as I'm aware. It came out in 1990, not necessarily a 100th or 150th anniversary of anything in particular, but it nevertheless feels like it captures a particular time in history and was made at a really crucial time, which we'll kind of get into. My familiarity with Ken Burns was somewhat robust, I suppose, given that I am not someone who has sat through all of his documentaries front to back by any means. I actually have not seen a ton of them, but I'm very familiar with his style, I think is a better way to put it. Ken Burns' style of filmmaking, what you'll see anecdotally referred to as the Ken Burns effect, is something that really, I think, reshaped how nonfiction stories could be told in a documentary setting. You really start to see that, I think, with this miniseries in particular, but you see that in every other Ken Burns piece. The only other one that I've watched in full was his baseball miniseries. That was the first one that I ever watched when I was a kid. But this Civil War one I actually didn't get to for a very long time, even though I had seen snippets of it for an extended period of time as well. It was one of those things that was on TV, and I was generally aware of it, but had never actually sat through and watched the thing start to finish. And that has obviously changed as I start getting into reading material that is really about the Civil War and the meat and bones of the conflict itself and this time in our history. I really feel like this documentary is an important way of framing that story, one, for the layperson, and two, for the individual such as myself who's very interested in the act of storytelling, because this documentary understands how to tell a story. And it is flawed. I think that's my first comment here, is that the Civil War is a flawed documentary. It does some things extremely well and obviously holds a lot of influence and import in many ways, but there are definitely issues with how it tells the story that I think are going to be apparent even to people who are not Civil War buffs. The effective parts of this documentary are the parts that I think are all broiled into this term. When we talk about the Ken Burns effect, everything is kind of sandwiched into that phrase. His documentaries are very, very reliant on kind of in the moment documentation, often in the form of photographs, or old school video clips, if they exist. So, for instance, his baseball documentary, very reliant on photographs once it gets into like the 1900s, 1910s, where there are actual black and white footage. Those start being incorporated even without sound. And combining this mixture of old school footage and photography, and how he shoots the photography. Again, that Ken Burns shot, these panning shots up and down and left and right, that really just kind of force the viewer to sit with the photograph for a few seconds and really take in all the details of it in a way that you wouldn't do if you were just staring at a stationary photo. That panning shot forces you to comprehend those pieces of it. And I think it's just it's so well done. And you mix that with the usage of music. Now, I'm not an expert in pre-1990 documentaries, although I have seen some, but I don't know if I can think of a documentary from before this period that uses music to the effect of the Civil War. And again, it's not necessarily using music as in there's a soundtrack going on at all times, or that it's an especially varied soundtrack. It's music that is sparse, music that fits the themes. And in the case of this documentary in particular, it's one or two pieces for the most part, one or two recordings, contemporary recordings of these kind of traditional Civil War songs and that sort of thing. As well as, again, the piece Ashokan Farewell, which is, again, uses this kind of consistent motif, I suppose, throughout the whole thing, kind of grounding you into this familiar space. And that familiarity is always kind of laced with this strong degree of sadness because of the topics that are being discussed here. And there's something emotionally compelling about techniques that Burns uses here that are so simple, especially when you kind of say them out loud like this, and yet clearly were not being done with this level of care and this level of intention before. And I think, as I said, the success of this documentary and how much it kind of shaped how information is presented in a television setting, that influence of what Burns is doing here and that approach is really felt all over the place. And I think it kind of, any documentary that you see on television today, I would say documentaries that you see on YouTube, potentially video essays and that sort of thing, all of those take cues directly or indirectly from the type of thing that Burns made popular here. And I also love the mixture of talking heads and actual kind of quotes that are interpreted. I love the usage of professional actors to read those quotes. And such a mixture of characters too. I mean, you have folks like Morgan Freeman, and at the time, young Morgan Freeman, Garrison Keillor. I mean, I suppose that dates it fairly firmly, but you have Garrison Keillor in there. But you also have Arthur Miller, of all people, fucking Death of a Salesman, Arthur Miller, recording these voiceovers in 1990. It really puts into perspective the timing of it. As I said, these inclusions date it to some extent, but it also gets across the timing, and it also gets across, how crucial it was that this documentary came out at that time period, even though it wasn't celebrating a specific anniversary. There are the scenes with Daisy Turner, the daughter of a former enslaved man. Those scenes, which were filmed several years, 3 or 4 years, I think, before the documentary were actually aired. And Daisy is kind of reciting memories to an extent, but a lot of times the clips that they are using are her reciting poetry. That was she was a well-known name in these kind of historical circles because she had such a clear memory of the poetry that of these kind of poems that are about like her own family's history and her own experience of kind of slavery, not herself, but her father's experience of slavery, and then kind of I don't know, the sort of after effects of everything. And those scenes are the most affecting and the most powerful and the most critical from a preservation standpoint. It's so, it's so rare to have these moments. We have so little footage overall of ex-slaves and children of enslaved folks and that sort of thing. In the grand scheme of things, we don't have that much documentation of that sort of thing, and that is so crucial to have, and especially to have kind of these moments, even in the 1980s of all times, to have these, folks who were children of people who were enslaved and having that level of recall as well. This is someone who is over 100 years old and still has the, if she's not sharp as a tack, she can still remember these feelings and these emotions and these words of the poetry that she wrote, and remembers it all so vividly. And it's such a powerful and emotionally affecting thing. And that is the emotional core of this whole documentary. And so when I say all of that, you might get the impression that this is going to be a very, kind of head over heels review, and that I was infatuated by this documentary. And maybe in some cases that is true. I think there are elements of this documentary that I think are absolutely superbly done. But I have frustrations with it. And I don't think my frustrations with this documentary are anything new. A lot of Civil War scholars have written think pieces and essays and critical papers talking about the flaws of this documentary. So what I'm saying is not going to add too much to that conversation, but if you're curious about those critiques, I urge you to read more into it. One of my biggest issues is structural. I find that this documentary, and I understand it's TV, you have to fit the format, you have to fit what the production company and what the television broadcaster wants of you, cutting it down to a certain amount of episodes, that type of thing. I understand that. But the lack of setting the scene, you get maybe an episode, and really it feels like kind of part of one episode. You only get that short amount of time to set the stage for this huge and major conflict and all these disparate pieces that come together to create the environment that in turn created the Civil War. You don't get a whole lot of discussion about slavery itself. Slavery is discussed, but it is, again, from the vantage point of it is one of the causes of the Civil War, and perhaps the main cause of the Civil War, but there were also other tensions and other things coming in as well. There's not a whole lot of conversation about, again, those major origin events, whether that's the Missouri Compromise, whether that's the Mexican-American War, Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Like all of this stuff, if it's mentioned, it's kind of breezed through because the rush is to get to the 1860 presidential election, because that's kind of the linchpin moment. That's the part where you pull the pin from the hand grenade and watch it all blow up. And they want to get to that point. And whether that's a time constraint, whether that's an editorial decision, whether that's a Ken Burns creative decision, I'm not entirely sure, but I think it hurts the documentary and prevents you from being able to feel all the emotions that should come with a discussion of the Civil War, all the many complex, frustrating, infuriating, saddening, gut-wrenching emotions. It feels like you're handicapped in that sense, and I think that's a frustrating thing to sit with. Also, we have to talk about the talking heads a little bit more specifically, because while I do like the mix between talking heads and actual quotes in the sense of how it is used as a storytelling technique and the ratio between those two things, The talking heads themselves are another thing entirely. I wish there was a more diverse set of people in general. I think that for the most part, you got to hear from about 2, 3, maybe 4 people in each episode. Quite often, you really are only hearing from like 2. One of them is Barbara Fields, who I think her pieces are great, and I think if anything, if any one perspective from one of the talking heads should have been leaned on for the whole discussion of this, I would have preferred it be hers, because I think she's the one who grasps kind of the totality of everything and really addresses that, and addresses kind of the slavery in a head-on way, and in a way that I don't think a lot of the other documentary pieces are capable of. So I wish they relied on her more, but they don't, because the whole kind of arc is dominated, and by dominated I say he appears the most in it, and it's not particularly close, is dominated by Shelby Foote. Now, Shelby Foote is someone who I'm going to be talking a little bit more about in an upcoming video, because I'm midway through reading his 3-volume Civil War history series, which is another reason why these videos have taken a while to come out lately. But Shelby Foote, to put it politely, is a complicated, controversial, and complex figure in the world of Civil War literature. And while I don't know if I would go so far as to say that Shelby Foote is actively, literally spreading lost cause mythology in the Civil War documentary, I know a lot of people say that he does. I can see the argument. I don't know if I would quite go that far, but there's certainly a sympathy to the plight of the Southern man, specifically, that Foote clearly has and expresses throughout the documentary. And because of that, and because of the amount of times that Foote is called upon to speak, it's very clear that he is driving that underlying narrative. It is his work, it is his lens, it is his perspective that Burns is latching onto to create this kind of narrative through line, I suppose. And given the many holes that people have poked in Shelby Foote's work, I think that is a decision on Burns' part that unfortunately cripples this documentary to the point where, from a historical standpoint, if you're looking to get a really solidly rooted in facts perspective on the history of the Civil War, I think this, at minimum, dates this documentary to high hell. And if it hasn't already become outdated to the point of not really being a viable way to teach on the subject anymore, it's probably pretty close. And that's really frustrating because of how many other things I think go superbly well in this. I love David McCullough as the narrator. A lot of respect for David McCullough in general. I've reviewed 1 or 2 of his books on this channel before. A lot of respect for him. Love him as a narrator. So many pieces that work really, really well. And I don't mind the, this thing that you get in all the Ken Burns documentaries, which is this unabashed sense of, patriotism and the need to defend America. I don't mind that. I have my qualms with, patriotism when it turns into nationalism, in a lot of ways, but I don't mind how he does it necessarily. But I do think that in this case, and given the people that he's called upon to give perspectives here, it just doesn't sit well. And it's kind of unfortunate. I mean, any documentary is going to age poorly after a while just because we learn more information about the person or the people or the history involved. So it was probably going to happen eventually. I tend to think that there were decisions that could have been made in this process that prevented it from happening as soon as it has. So what are we left with? The Civil War documentary is a very important piece of media in and of itself. And I think if you approach the documentary from that standpoint, and if you approach the documentary from the vantage point of trying to learn how to tell a story and trying to learn what to do and what not to do, if you approach it from that lens, I think it's worth your time. Very well worth your time. If you're approaching this documentary from the lens of someone who wants to learn more about the Civil War and really wants a good, solid resource that's rooted in facts and objectivity and that sort of thing, this is not the place I would recommend. If there's a place I would recommend, on YouTube, there's a great series of lectures by the great author David Blight about the history of the Civil War. It's absolutely phenomenal. Highly recommended. I learned a lot, and he's, they're college lectures, but David Blight, very entertaining, very engaging lecturer, almost as good a lecturer as he is a writer. So watch that instead. But there's value in the Civil War as a mini-series, as a storytelling device, and as a piece of history in and of itself. And I want to acknowledge that amidst all the criticisms. And I do ultimately respect Ken Burns for what he does, what he's brought to the art of nonfiction storytelling. And I think there's pieces of this that a lot of people could benefit and learn from. With that, thank you so much for watching this video. Please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. As always, more videos are to come. Make sure to hit that bell for notifications if you haven't already, and tell a friend as well. We do have a Discord server that just started. I am going to include a link to that in the description box. So feel free to join if you are interested in that. I'm not sure how long this will be public facing for right now, but figure we can start it, see if we can't build a little bit of a music deep dive community there. So if you're interested in talking more about music, books, all that sort of thing, check out the description box for more info on the Discord. But until next time, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time, right here at your home of the Music Deep Dive.